Anita Diamant is the best-selling author of the novels The Red Tent, which was recently turned into a television miniseries airing on Lifetime, I believe, right now. Other titles she has written include Good Harbor, The Last Days of Dogtown, and Day After Night, and a collection of essays pitching my tent, among other numerous titles. She has also written for Boston Globe Magazine, Parenting Magazine, New England Monthly, Yankee, and more. The Boston Girl, the novel she presents to us tonight, is her 5th novel and 12th book, and is clearly the next evolution of Anita's signature style, a historical context coupled with a keen eye for detail and compelling and thoughtful female characters. Please join me in welcoming Anita Diamant with her novel The Boston Girl to Brookline Books now.
Thank you, Zoe. Thank you for being here. About 16 years ago, I was invited for the first time to be at Brookline Booksmith, which is a big venue, very exciting, and it was a blizzard. It was a blizzard. I had jury duty. I ran from Cambridge. It took an hour. 6 people showed up who could walk. So 6 women, we sat in a circle, and we had a very nice time, and tonight's a flood. So, but there's more of you, so thank you for coming. This is my first, the book was published today. It's the birthday of the book. And this is my first presentation of The Boston Girl to an audience, so I feel like a comedian trying on new material. So we'll see what works. So The Boston Girl is Addie Baum. She's the main character, and she narrates the story. It's told in the first person. And to introduce her, I'm going to read the beginning of the book. It's divided by years, and so it starts in 1985, and then it goes way back. But so here's 1985 and Addie Baum. And the title of this section is called Nobody Told You? Ava, sweetheart, if you ask me to talk about how I got to be the woman I am today, what do you think I'm going to say? I'm flattered you want to interview me. And when did I ever say no to my favorite grandchild? I know, I say that to all my grandchildren, and I mean it every single time. That sounds ridiculous or like I'm losing my marbles, but it's true. When you're a grandmother, you'll understand. And why not? Look at the 5 of you, a doctor, a social worker, 2 teachers, and now you. Oh, of course they're going to accept you into that program. Don't be silly. My father is probably rolling in his grave, but I think it's wonderful. Don't tell the rest of them, but you really are my favorite, and not only because you're the youngest. Did you know you were named after me? It's a good story. Everyone else is named after someone who died, like your sister Jessica, who was named for my nephew Jake. But I was very sick when you were born, and when they thought I wasn't going to make it, they went ahead and hoped that the angel of death wouldn't make a mistake and take you, Ava, instead of me, Addie. Your parents weren't that superstitious, but they had to tell everyone you were named after your father's cousin Arlene, so people wouldn't give them a hard time. It's a lot of names to remember, I know. Grandpa and I named your Aunt Sylvia for your grandfather's mother who died in the flu epidemic. Your mother is Clara after my sister Celia. What do you mean you didn't know I had a sister named Celia? That's impossible. Betty was the oldest, then Celia, and then me. Maybe you forgot. Nobody told you? You're sure? Well, maybe it's not such a surprise. People don't talk so much about sad memories, and it was a long time ago. But you should know this, so go ahead. Turn on the tape recorder. My father came to Boston from what must be Russia now. He took my sisters, Betty and Celia, with him. It was 1896 or maybe 1897, I'm not sure. My mother came 3 or 4 years later, and I was born here in 1900. I've lived in Boston my whole life, which anyone can tell the minute I open my mouth. So I'm not going to try to do a Boston accent. Everybody does it badly. That's Addie Baum, and then we go back to her childhood, and I'll read you a little bit of that in a minute. But the backstory of this book is very different from my other books. I set out to write a very different book than this, and it was called Rockport Lodge. And that was the title on my contract, and that's the title of the manuscripts that I worked on for 3 years. And the reason I started with Rockport, which brought me to Addie, actually, but for many years, my family's vacationed on Cape Ann, and we drove up and down South Street in Cape Ann and passed this inn with a sign out in front called Rockport Lodge for years, and I didn't pay any attention to it. It looked like all the other inns, more or less. in Rockport. But then one day, this friend of mine walked out the front door, Patty Chase, and with her dog. And I stopped and I said, "What are you doing here?" And she was a cook and a chef, and she was cooking at the lodge. And she explained to me that it was not like all the other inns in Rockport. It was women only. It had been women only since it was founded in 1906, 1907. And she cooked 3 meals a day for them, and that you got 3 meals a day along with your very low rent. Even it must have been in the mid 80s when I ran into her, and it was something like $75 a week and 3 meals a day. Ridiculous. And it turned out later, I found out that friends of mine had stayed there over the years as well. And it had been founded so I started to do a little reading about it, not a lot. It had been founded again in the beginning of in the early 1900s by women of the progressive era who were interested in providing respite, vacation, outdoor activity to girls who might not otherwise have it. It was also founded by the Mass League of Girls Clubs. If you were a member of any of the clubs, for the Massachusetts League of Girls Clubs, there was a big girls clubs movement in the 1900s. You could go. When it was founded, it was about $5 a week, something like that, and 3 really good meals a day. Patty did not have much of a budget when she was cooking up there. So I started paying attention to Rockport Lodge after I realized what it was. But it was way past its heyday, and over the next few years I watched it disintegrate, literally. I mean, the lawn wasn't cut so much anymore, and it needed paint badly. And then one summer there were no lights on, and there were weeds growing out of the gutters, and I went up to the porch and started to look in the window, and it looked like it was still waiting for people to come. There were books and magazines on the side tables, and the dining room had a whole set of blue willow dishes on the wall, and the chairs and the tables were like waiting for someone to come back, and it never opened again. And that looked to me like a steamer trunk in an attic, full of full of stuff to look through. It was certainly a story. And so I decided I would write a book on Rockport Lodge. First thing I did was try to find the papers, and I went to what was then Radcliffe, the Schlesinger Library on the History of American Women. And there were 47 boxes of uncatalogued material, most of it not so interesting. There were bills for Picnic Kitchen, and there were minutes of meetings, but there were also scrapbooks, which were very interesting. And they had, girls would write messages to each other and poems and little jokes, and there were also photographs, which were really very, they were evocative, and they made me wish that I could know the names of these people and where they came from. And there were pictures at the very beginning of girls in ankle-length dresses and shirtwaists, pulled cinched in at the waist. And then you started seeing. Then there were pictures from the 1920s wearing what must have been very racy bathing suits, on the beach. Then there were slacks came in, and bobby socks and shorts, and so sort of the progression of women's apparel in the 20th century, which I realized was an extremely important change in the liberation of women from those hobbling skirts and corsets to no corsets and pants. So I thought I would write about the lodge I thought, okay, 1907 to 1989 when it closed, and I thought I would somehow get all these girls back every year. It would be something like, you remember the movie Same Time Next Year, where this couple comes back to this place every year. And I tried, and it didn't work. It kind of crashed and burned. But I had from the beginning been working with a bunch of characters of girls who met actually in Boston, and one of them was Addie. And Addie was always kind of the central organizing principle. And so when I went back to rewrite it in a way that might work, it was still called the Rockport Lodge, but she sort of took over. I put it in her voice. I had been writing it in the third person, and then it became Addie's story. So that's how Rockport Lodge became the Boston Girl, and that's Addie. So now I'm going to read you a little bit from 1915, really, where she starts telling her story to her granddaughter. Where I lived in the North End when I was a little girl wasn't so quaint. The neighborhood smelled of garbage and worse. In my building, to go to the bathroom, we had to walk down 3 flights from our apartment to the outhouses in back. Those were disgusting, believe me, but the stairways were what really scared me. At night, you couldn't see your hand in front of your face, and it was slippery from all the dirt and grease. One lady broke a leg on those steps, and she never walked right again afterwards. In 1915, there were 4 of us living in one room. We had a stove, a table, a few chairs, and a saggy couch that Mama and Papa slept on at night. Celia and I shared a bed in a kind of narrow hallway that didn't go anywhere. The landlords chopped up those apartments to squeeze in more people so they could get more rent. The only good thing about our place was that we had a window that looked out on the street, so there was a little light. A lot of the apartments faced the air shaft, where it was always the middle of the night. Mama didn't like it when I looked out the window. "What if someone saw you there?" she said. "It makes you look like you have nothing better to do." I didn't understand why it bothered her, but I kept my mouth shut so I wouldn't get a smack. We were poor, but not starving. Papa worked in a belt factory as a cutter, and Celia was a finisher at a little shirtwaist factory upstairs over an Italian butcher shop. I don't think we called it a sweatshop back then, but that's what it was. And in the summer, it was steaming hot. When my mother wasn't cooking or cleaning, she was mending sheets for the laundry across the street. I think she got a penny apiece. Together, they made enough money for rent and food. Mostly, I remember eating potatoes and cabbage, and I still can't stand the smell of cabbage. Sometimes Mama took in a boarder, usually a man right off the boat who needed a place to flop for a few nights. I didn't mind because she didn't yell so much if one of them was in the house, but they made Celia nervous. Celia was delicate. That's what Mama called her. My sister was thin and had high cheekbones like my father, blue eyes, fine brown hair like him too. She would have been as pretty as the drawings in the magazines, but she was so shy that she winced when people talked to her, especially the men Mama pushed at her. Celia didn't like to go out of the house. She said it was because her English was bad. Actually, she understood a lot, but she wouldn't talk. My mother was like that too. Papa managed a little better, but at home, we spoke only Yiddish. When Mama talked about Celia to the neighbors, she said, 29 years old already, like it was a death sentence. But in the next breath, she'd brag, "My Celia has such golden hands. She could sew the wings on a bird. And such a good girl, modest, obedient, never gives me any trouble." I was the other one. The other one is almost 15 years old and still in school. Selfish and lazy. She pretends she can't sew. But I wasn't pretending. Every time I picked up a needle, I stabbed myself. One time when Mama gave me a sheet to help with her sewing, I left so many little blood stains she couldn't wash them out. She had to pay for the sheet, which cost her I don't know how many days of work. I got a good smack for that, I can tell you. You wouldn't know Celia and I were sisters from looking at us. We had the same nose, a little flat and straight, and we were both a little more than 5 feet. But I was built like my mother, solid, not fat, and curvy, starting at 13. I had Mama's thin wrists and her reddish-brown hair, which was so thick it could break the bristles on a brush. I thought I was a real plain Jane, except for my eyes, which are like yours, Ava, hazel with a little gold circle in the middle. I was only 10 years old when my oldest sister, Betty, moved out of the house. I remember I was hiding under the table the day she left. Mama was screaming about how girls were supposed to live with their families until they got married, and the only kind of woman who went out on her own was a kurva. That's whore in Yiddish. I had to ask a kid at school what that meant. After that, Mama never said Betty's name in public. But at home, she talked about her all the time. A real American, she said, making it sound like a curse. But it was true. Betty had learned English fast, and she dressed like a modern girl. She wore pointy shoes with heels, and you could see her ankles. She got herself a job selling dresses downtown at Filene's department store, which was unusual for someone who wasn't born in this country. I didn't see her much after she moved out, and I missed her. It was too quiet without Betty in the house. I didn't mind that there was less fighting between her and Mama, but she was the only one who ever got Celia and my father to laugh. So, introduction to the Baum family. I've written 4 historical novels. This is the 4th one, and doing research for them is really a pleasure. I really enjoy that a lot. This one was relatively easy because it's all Boston, and although I did some research about the Rockport Lodge, that was pretty much all in those boxes. I did interview a few people whose grandmothers had gone to Rockport Lodge way back when. My friends who'd been, it was not the part of the history that I was going to be focusing on, was the 70s and 80s. But so I did research about this period in history from about 1915 in particular to 1930, and it was fascinating. I love Boston. I've lived here since 1975. There's nowhere for me to go back to. This is it. This is home. And the history that I learned was a lot of the progressive era history, and so I learned a lot about, and particularly women's history, which was obviously the focus of this book. So I mentioned the huge change in women's clothes and what that must have felt like from the inside to try on pants for the first time, which Addie does at one point. Can you imagine having been in a skirt your whole life and having somebody hand you a pair of trousers, and what that, to walk around a room in that. So the history that I tell in this story is through the eyes of the characters, especially Addie. So that's her experience of the change in clothing. She grew up in a time when popular culture was just starting. Movies were everywhere and cheap. Movie magazines, celebrity culture was gearing up. The new woman, the woman who would go to college, was talked about. Flappers were coming into being. So there were all these new models of womanhood from the inside to the outside. It was a time, the early 20s in particular, when women were going to college in numbers that had never happened before. So that was a possibility for Addie. And in the distance someplace, it was an aspiration of hers, a difficult one for somebody from her kind of background. The other thing that was happening around that time was there was an opening for women in new jobs. I wouldn't call them quite professions. Women became typists. Men didn't have patience for it, and their fingers were too big, and so women became typists and were underpaid. Women also became telephone operators, like in those connecting with the wires. Again, something that they thought women could take care of because women didn't get bored as fast. That was another excuse. But retail opened up. So I introduced you to Betty, who had a job at Filene's, which was open already then in 1915. And there were men on the floor too, but ladies' clothing required lady salespeople, and so those stores became opportunities for women to have jobs as well. And a little more higher on the food chain, librarians that became a job that opened to women, especially they may not have been the president or the director of the library, but women ran the branch libraries in Greater Boston, and some of them did really interesting kind of diversity stuff way before anybody was thinking that way. So there was a woman in East Boston who had a Negro week where she put out books. She found books from black writers and she put them out, and she had Italian week, and she had a Jewish week, and she had a Polish week, and this is before anybody was thinking like that. So that's the kind of neat stuff that I found out. In this period of history also, I hope you like a little history, Boston had the first law school for women only. It was the Portia School of Law, which is now the New England School of Law downtown, and it was a for-profit. It was a for-profit school started by a man who saw that there were that in the immigrant and in the working community there was some hunger for that kind of learning. And then BU actually opened its doors was one of the first places to allow women to go to law school. Simmons College was an alternative to the kind of fancy colleges, right? Wellesley, Radcliffe was still being formed at Harvard. And it was a school to give women practical skills, practical education. It had the first kind of business school for women, and one of the first social work schools as well. And so all of these things were happening, and there were women who were starting programs like kindergartens in Boston, one of the first kindergarten programs, hot lunches for students. These were all they were all started by and pushed into existence and staffed by women who had the means to some extent. These were not women making a living, but they were pushing the progressive agenda to create better opportunities for people. And it wasn't all sweetness and light. There was a real sense of wanting to turn immigrants into good Americans, and they should stop talking their home languages, and they should stop cooking like that and using garlic, and they should, and all of that going on at the same time. So a lot of this book refers to these people, to some of these people. Some of them are real characters. You get to meet Miss Chevalier in here, who is one of Addie's great mentors, who's based on a character called Miss Guerriere, Chevalier Guerriere. And then Miss Green is based on Miss Brown, who were two women who, in fact, staffed the Bennett Street Settlement House, which became the Bennett Street Industrial School, which is still in existence to some extent. And so, they're a different class of women. They are not wealthy women. They are women who, with some kind of education, seminary kind of educations, and who made a living for themselves carefully in sort of middle class kinds of professional ways. The settlement house was a 4-story building that stood out from everything else in the neighborhood. It was new, with yellow bricks instead of red, and it had electricity in all the rooms, so at night it lit up the street like a lantern. It was busy all day. There was a baby nursery for mothers who worked, a wood shop to teach boys a trade, and English classes for immigrants. After dark, women would come to ask for food and coal so their children wouldn't freeze or starve. The neighborhood really was that poor. Miss Edith Chevalier was in charge of all of that and a lot more. She's the one who started the library groups for girls. One for the Irish, one for the Italians, one for the Jews. Sometimes she would look in and ask what we were reading, not to test us, but just because she wanted to know. That's what happened one day when my club was reading The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. We were reading out loud, and I guess I was better than the others because after the meeting, Miss Chevalier asked if I would recite the whole poem to the Saturday Club. She said a famous professor was going to give a lecture about Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, and she thought a presentation of his most famous poem would be a nice way to start the evening. She said that I would have to memorize it, but that shouldn't be a problem for a girl of your ability. I'm telling you, my feet didn't touch the ground all the way home. It was the biggest thing that ever happened to me, and I learned the whole poem by heart in 2 days, so I'd be ready for our first rehearsal. Miss Chevalier was a small woman. She was a few inches shorter than me, which meant less than 5 feet. She had a moon face and chubby fingers and coppery hair that sprang straight up from her head, which is why some of the girls called her the poodle. But she had one of those smiles that makes you feel like you just did something right, which was a good thing since I was a nervous wreck when I went to her office to practice. I only got halfway through the poem when Miss Chevalier stopped me and asked if I knew what impetuous meant. She was nice about it, but I wanted to sink through the floor because not only did I not know what the word meant, I had mispronounced it. I'm sure I turned bright red, but Miss Chevalier pretended not to notice and handed me the dictionary and said to read the definition out loud. I will never forget. Impetuous means 2 things: rushing with great force or violence and acting suddenly with little thought. She asked me which one I thought Mr. Longfellow meant. I reread those definitions over and over, trying to figure out the right answer. But Miss Chevalier must have read my mind. There is no wrong answer, she said. I want to know your opinion, Addie. What do you think? I had never been asked for my opinion, but I knew I couldn't keep her waiting, so I said the first thing that came into my head, which was, maybe he meant both? She liked that. The Patriots had to be impetuous both ways, or they wouldn't have dared challenge the British. And then she asked, would you call yourself impetuous, Addie? That time I knew she was asking for an opinion. My mother thinks I am. She said mothers were right to be concerned for their daughters' welfare. But I believe that girls need gumption too, especially in this day and age. I believe you are a girl with gumption. After I looked up gumption, I never let anyone call Miss Chevalier the poodle again. So she does read to, she reads the, I'm gonna read you the, when she does get to read to the group. The Saturday Girls, which is based on Saturday Evening Girls, was different from the other clubs, which I'm going to tell you about in a minute. And Addie has to stand in front of a group of people and perform. And I don't know if any of you remember doing that as a child for the first time. When it goes well, you never forget it. So for the Saturday night, she's practiced and she's getting there. The Saturday club was different from all the other clubs. It was bigger, 50 girls of 10 or 12, instead of 10 or 12 like mine, and all the religions were together. They were older too. Some were in high school, but a lot of them had jobs. They also held elections and ran their own meetings. I was only 3 or 4 years younger than most of them, but to me, they were practically grown-ups. Miss Chevalier was at the door and sent me to sit in the front row while she waited for the professor. She said he should be there any moment, but 5 minutes passed and another 5, and I was getting more and more nervous. My hands were shaking when he finally got there. He looked so much like the pictures of Longfellow with the white beard and the long hair. It was as if he'd come back from the dead. Rose Reardon, who was the club president, banged a gavel and made some announcements. I didn't hear a word. Miss Chevalier had to tap me on the shoulder when it was time for me to go up to the platform, and my knees were like rubber. I had a lot to remember, and not just the words. Miss Chevalier had given me a lot of directions to add to the drama. This was the North End of Boston, where every school child knew the midnight ride, and we were all pretty sick of it. Miss Chevalier gave me a big smile and a nod to start me off. I remembered to begin as if I were a little out of breath, like I had a surprise to tell, and then I tried to make Paul Revere seem like a real person, tapping my foot to make it look like he was impatient to get going. I whispered about the graves being lonely and spectral and somber and still, making it sound spooky. At the end, I went very, very slow. Then I counted to 3, bowed my head like Miss Chevalier showed me. There was a big round of applause and even a 3 cheers for Addie Baum. After the lecture, I was the belle of the ball. Girls I didn't know came over to say what a good job I'd done and asked where I worked and did I want another piece of cake or punch. So this is one of those moments in Addie's life where she's front and center. She's been coached by this woman who sees in her gumption, sees in her intelligence, and actually remains in the background a helpful presence in her life for many, many years to come. There's a great story to be told and probably a documentary to be made about the Saturday Evening Girls, which were a remarkable club of young women, which was who are best known for pottery, for making the Paul Revere pottery, which is at the MFA, if you want to see it. It's beautiful, kind of arts and crafts looking, beautifully colored stuff under the direction of Edith Green, who was an artist who went to the Museum of Fine Arts School, who was an illustrator, illustrated children's books. And she encouraged, both of these women encouraged a whole generation of young women to work in the pottery. Some of them were very talented artists. Some of them just were given the opportunity to practice a skill that they had never had before. But I changed a lot. I wanted in some ways to tell that story accurately, but if I had done that, I couldn't have told Addie's story the way I wanted to tell it, which is to get her out of there and moving on into different adventures in her life. When I'm writing historical fiction, I want to be true to the period, and in this case, I was really basing this on real people in a real place, but not completely, which is why I changed their names. And I changed Saturday Evening Girls to Saturday Girls. So if you know this history, you know I'm cheating a little bit that way. The book takes Addie through the experience of World War I and the flu epidemic. It takes her out of her home and into a rooming house, a women's rooming house. It takes her into various careers, a couple of disastrous relationships with men until she finds the love of her life. It takes a while. And ultimately she finds meaningful work and becomes a professional and teaches after she's had her children. And so her life follows the arc of a lot of women. It's not in a lot of ways. In some ways, it's a very ordinary life that she lives. This is not, she's not what one would call a role model. She's not somebody who would make it into any kind of a history book. But the arc of her life follows the extraordinary changes in women's lives and the history of Boston as well. And again, it's a life filled with dignity and pathos and humor and intelligence. And I think those are the kinds of stories, those are always the stories that I like to tell, the ones that are sort of off the radar screen. I thought that for a while. I thought it wasn't enough that Addie could have a happy marriage and then find her career. But in fact, I like telling stories of people who, when you talk to people about their stories, they say, I don't really have a story to tell you. But of course, everyone has some story, and if you ask the right questions, you get really interesting stuff back. So with that, I think I'll stop now, and if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. So. Thunderous silence. It's a lot. I threw a lot at you. No? Yeah.
How do you come up with the names and the
Oh.
personalities of the characters?
The names and the personalities, and how I came up with the names. Addie came out early. Addie Baum was there. There's one of her closest friends in the book is named Filomena Gallinelli, which is a mouthful. And I wanted her to be Italian, and I came up with various names. And I came up with Filomena early, and I got pushback from one of my editors because the movie Filomena came out. Remember that movie? He said, "Oh, everyone's going to think of that." But it's one of these great old Italian names, and it's a name that I had heard. My mother had a friend who worked in the sewing worlds with her. My mother worked in the needle trades, and one of her coworkers was named Filomena, and I thought it was an amazing name. And Gallinelli is a name in Newton that I saw on the side of a truck, and I just thought it was really musical. It's a musical name. Some of the names. The name of the bad guy in this book took me a long time. I kept changing him. He was Smith for a while. That doesn't work. He needed a real last name. Sometimes they're very easy. They come right away. And sometimes you just keep rewriting them and until it lands somehow. And it's something in the ear. And I work with two other writers in a writing group. And they were very helpful about names. And when it's right, I usually get a, yeah, that's good. That's okay.
Visceral.
Visceral. It's visceral, yeah. It's not so intellectual, yeah. It should sound right. It shouldn't have the same first initial letter as too many other names because that gets confusing, so there's a little of that. But it's visceral. Yeah.
I'm curious about the process and relationship between you and the editor, your editor.
The relationship between me and my editor?
Yeah.
I got to work when I was really revising with a very dear friend who was the editor of The Red Tent as well, and many years ago. And we became friends, and I just trusted him. So I really struggled with how to reframe this, and he kept walking me off the ledge, and we kept talking until it was viscerally right. I mean, until we figured out, oh, it has to be first person. Oh, it needs to be, you do need to cut all these lovely characters out that you'd written in the previous book. They have to go. And so it's a lot of trust. I love working with a good editor. And when he would say, you really need to lose this, and my writing partners too would say that along the way. I didn't necessarily listen to them so much, but I finally heard it when Bob said it to me. And the book is dedicated to him in part. And it was a great process. It was a great collaboration. So you have to have a lot of trust and faith. And he had a lot of faith in me, and I had a lot of trust in him. It was great. Any other questions? Okay, yeah.
What made you finally decide to switch from third person to first?
What made me decide to switch from third person to first? When I was doing the rewrite, I was doing it in the third person again. It was just not working. It was just not, I felt like I'd given it a good try. I couldn't do anymore. And then in a conversation with Bob, which lasted for a good 45 minutes on the phone, I thought, okay, I'll try that. I came up with it. He said, okay, try it. And then it worked, and then it worked. And I actually think the first draft was in the first person. I think it was back and forth, and I should have, you should always go with your first instinct, I suppose. And in a funny way, and maybe this is where we end, this is after I'd finished this, and because the Red Tent hoopla was going on, and I was being asked about both things at the same time, this book is not unlike the Red Tent in a funny way, in that there's a voice from the past telling the story of her life to the future, the next generation. In this book, Addie's still alive. In the Red Tent, it's this disembodied voice from beyond the grave talking to who knows whom. But this is a woman who has a relationship enough with her granddaughter. They know each other enough, they trust each other enough to have this kind of a conversation. And to me, that's unbelievably satisfying. And again, they're both in the first person. They both tell a bit of an epic story of history from the perspective of one person who's off to the side, not a central character in Boston's history, not a central character in the Bible. And to me, the great progress from that epic, biblical epic to this one is that the grandmother and the granddaughter actually have a relationship with each other, and the granddaughter is eager to listen, and the grandmother is eager to talk. And to me, that's I think that's a life well lived. So that's it. Thank you very much.
And Hogan is beside himself at this moment. He is just blown away by what he's seeing and everything, and he says, "No, man, you're wrong! You're wrong! You're wrong! When I won the world title, he poured champagne over my head. It was like a bond of friendship. You're wrong!"